What can we do with this recently upgraded Tuxedo, sporting an AMD FX? Finally!
The wacky world of MultimediaJay.
When last we tinkered, I had installed an FX 8320E in Tuxedo and satiated one of my long-running curiosities about AMD processors from before Ryzen launched. Basically, yeah, exactly how good of a system could you build given the limitations and handicaps of the FX series. So I decided to go with an 8320E, the hippie chip of the series that can still be bought firsthand all over the place, now that the Ryzen has pretty much displaced all the remaining demand for FXs for new systems. Unless, of course, you have an AM3 era system that you wanted to put one of these into to upgrade it from whatever it was before. That's really the only use left for these things. There are Ryzens at the same price point these days that use today's hardware that would be a much better buy for someone building an AMD system from scratch. But for someone doing everything possible to keep an old AMD system from 2010 running, well, that's a completely different story. First order of business, I switched it over to power saver mode so it throttles down as quickly as possible. I want to answer a hair splitter question I have about fans. I've noticed that the amperage on a lot of the fractal fans I'm using is notably higher than the Cooler Masters of the same size. So I'm going to downgrade this system to one of these for its main cooling fan and see it barely affect the wattage of what it pulls from the wall. So this thing's bottoming out at 65 watts. So I'll leave it in power saver mode, hook up this Cooler Master in lieu of the actual fan by just swapping the plugs temporarily, and let's see how much lower that watt meter goes. I got a feeling I'd be better off getting a better fan controller than fans with lower current on systems that run cooler. I'm not actually going to remove the fractal fan because I do like it and want to keep it. I'm just curious about how much the wattage drops to bring in this significantly lower amperage Cooler Master fan, so I've basically bypassed this thing, and this won't spin, but this will, and we'll see what happens when we apply power. Probably the dumbest hair-splitting thing I've ever done with a computer in order to make it more power efficient, but oh well. As planned, the right stuff spins up and the right stuff doesn't. Let's see what the wattage gets down to once it's up and running. The correct answer, as you just saw, is a fraction of a watt, which means I'm splitting hairs too much. Previously it went down to 65 something, now it goes down to 65 even. Like I figured, the solution is not fans that draw less current. The solution is a fan controller that when you turn it down, increases the resistance and thus slows the fans down even more than the one that I'm currently using in Monolith. Anyways, let's fix this fan fiasco and get back to what counts here. You have to admit though, if you go back to the earlier days of this machine, when it still had its stock cooler and it still made quite a bit of noise, and even the times when I messed around with an 80mm fan in the front of this thing, just what it has become, how cool it runs, and how quiet it runs is just amazing. Of course, that's because I always believed in giving components plenty of space to breathe. Yes, this is a large Alienware size, early 2000s Alienware, I should say, size tower that would sit on the floor and totally look like a computer in a living room setting, but at least everything would run nice and cool because there's somewhere for the heat to go. Plus, it's old school ATX with the power supply up top to help exhaust hot air from the case, though I'm guessing the direct output through through the Evo cooler as well as the big fan 140 right there to blow the air right out, I'm sure probably helps with that a little more. But it's just amazing. If I can find some way to make Tuxedo stay relevant for a few more years, it'd be cool to see how far this system goes. And I think this FX chip is exactly the way to do that. Alright, when last we left off, we were looking at overclocking this thing, and I'm not a big fan of overclocking, but I figured, let's mess around with it on here just for the heck of it. It's not going to be much of an overclocker, I can tell you that much, for various reasons we'll get into later. We also observed that this machine seems to run cooler than every other machine that I have, but it also has a lower TJ Max, or maybe I'm just too used to Intel chips. If I remember right, the 1090Ti capped out at 67 degrees Celsius, and it's the Intels that can go to 100 plus. So that's basically, so we have a little bit of wiggle room here. We're at 10 right now, minimum 9, maximum 32. Max before we start having thermal issues is at 80. I don't think this is going to be much of an overclocker because of the RAM that's in it, the stock RAM from when I went to the 1090Ti in 2010. So anything that would increase the speed of the RAM, like an FSB overclock, is probably out of the question. So I'm just going to mess around with the multiplier. Plus, I want to see if it's any better than the 1090Ti was. With the 1090Ti, the most you could do is make the turbo frequency the standard frequency, because the minute you went beyond any of that, you lost all the power-saving features on the processor, and these AMDs haven't exactly been known for being good with power. So having them run full blast all the time was a total disaster. I don't know if this one will fare much better as the hippie chip, so to speak. So yeah, let's do some experimenting here and try not to fry the brand new chip. Current speed range, this thing will throttle down to 1406, but it will also go all the way up to 4 GHz in turbo mode. So it's definitely a wide range of speeds available. So I imagine the multiplier should be somewhat interesting. Heck, maybe even go in the opposite direction. Lower the multiplier, but increase the maximum that it can go to try and make the chip even greener. Here's where all the fun can happen. Set the ratio, which determines the CPU frequency. We can also check the performance boost ratio, and maybe have a situation where things flying around all over the place. I've already downclocked the standard ratio from 3.2 down to 2 GHz. Let's see if it even still boots. Save and exit. This is gonna get pretty ugly. Why are you slowing your computer down? Actually, I want to see how low it's going to go. Then I'll crank the performance boost back up and see if I can make this chip even greener. This is supposed to be the hippie chip, but right now it doesn't exactly foot the bill. Nope, everything's all screwed up now and the thing won't throttle down. Back to the BIOS. See, this is the weird part. Even though it doesn't throttle down to 800 megahertz, you can type a 1 for the multiplier and it'll bounce it up to 4 and set the speed at 0.8 gigahertz. That's weird. But let's see what happens. Well, this is messed up. Now I've flipped it in reverse and it's reverse clocking. So if there's not much going on, it goes at 3.5 to 4 gigahertz, and then when it gets more than X amount % of a load, it drops down to 800 megahertz. Weird. Everything's back to automatic mode for now, so it's going to go back to 3.2 gigahertz when we restart it. Let's see if unlocking the CPU disables the temperature monitor like it did on the Phenom 2. So, yep, save and change. The whole thing turns off, and then it turns itself back on 5 seconds later, right? Yeah, this is the descendant of the 1090Ti, alright. Cool. Some things do get better over time. Now, let's see if this fixes that issue with the clocks, if we downclock the heck out of it while it's unlocked. Okay, unlock is turned on and the ratio is set down to 4. Will it throttle down below 1.5 gigahertz when nothing exciting's going on? Well now, there's our answer on that one.
Epic fail.
Okay, I'm pushing everything too low. Now this thing's turning itself off all the time. On, off, on, off, on, off. I've reduced this machine to a lazy bum of a CPU. Let's put everything back on stock. If it comes back up. Might have to disconnect the power for this one. Power disconnected. Immediately turns off. Turns itself back on. I don't like that the lights are dimming either. Shuts itself right off. Turns itself on again. Things do spin up this time. And nothing happens. Where's... or not. BIOS! It's not belly aching because, well, I really don't feel like working with a computer that takes 5 tries to turn itself on every time. Back to stock settings.
Epic fail.
Back to, Set the unlock back to disabled, and it starts on the first try now, right? It doesn't turn itself on and off all the time? I don't know. I may want to keep things somewhat locked on this thing. Look at that. One start, one beep. Here we come, Windows. Next up, the most rudimentary overclock that you can do on a processor that lets you mess with the multiplier. Set the turbo frequency as the standard frequency. Reboot loop. Yup. Nuts. Let's try something else.
Epic fail.
Ratcheted everything down to 3.6 with 4 still as the turbo frequency. Let's see how many points we gain in Nova Bench if this will run stable. I don't know if I want to mess with the voltage or anything just yet. I want this thing to ratchet the voltage up and down on its own. That's one of the ways in which this thing ran cool. Please wait. Oh, great. Now we gotta run the check disk thing, right? It looks like Windows didn't load correctly. Oops.
Epic fail.
Cool. 3.6 to 4 got me in. I'll bet 3.8 to 4 would work as well. Let's see what it throttles down to when it's not doing anything, and let's see what it gets for Nova Bench. Remember, we gotta get up to 700 in order for this thing to have as much muscle as the Delosaurus. But even then, it still won't win on efficiency. This is cool. The throttle down speed is now 1400 megahertz. Interesting. Wonder what 3.8 would give us for numbers. Unfortunately, well, yeah, we got down to 66 watts or so, without going into power save mode for the minimum wattage. So this thing's still throttling down like it should. Let's try running Nova Bench. Processor tests at 3.6 base speed, 99 watts, without getting the graphics involved. I'm trying not to get the lamp glare from the torch lamps to mess with what we have here. Might actually have to not lean back in the chair. 97, 96. I think 3.8 would work too. Look at our speeds. We got 3.5. We got 3.5s and 4s going there, and some ratcheting down sometimes. But I wonder if turning off core performance boost would work if we wanted this to run at 4 gigahertz all the time. My issue is, though, the core performance boost will actually adjust the voltage as well, kind of like a built-in overclock and stuff. That's really the most rudimentary thing we can do with these things, though, is to get them to run at their turbo frequency all the time with aftermarket cooling. It doesn't look like the graphics have improved any. Are we hitting 200 watts? 185, 187. We are still rocking the 1050 Ti from the Delosaurus to be a little greener while we test everything, since we're mostly looking at improving the CPU score here. 186, and it's just about finishing up here. One more compute test. 1497. We're in the mid-6s. Let's mess around with a few more settings. I'm still curious if we can get the turbo frequency turbo frequency to be the standard frequency. We're actually losing points versus the stuff from earlier, but it's pretty much margin of error at this point. Let's try a ratio of 20 for 4 gigahertz with core performance boost disabled because there's nothing to boost to. We're going to have the standard frequency the turbo frequency as a standard frequency with no boost functionality. Machine shuts off. What happens when it comes back on? If it gets into Windows, we're making progress. Must be because we changed some frequencies on the CPU. So I know unlocking it would mess with some stuff too. So we do get a startup. We get the gigabyte screen. We get the swirly thing on the bottom, right? Okay. Do we get Windows? Love looking at that little red sticker. Oh, there we go. Best seat in the house. See a little of everything. No, we do not. We get a shut off and then a restart.
Epic fail.
Set the base clock to 19.5 for 3.9 gigahertz, giving this the worst turbo in the world. This is me really splitting hairs with this multiplier type stuff. The base clock can be set to auto as well, apparently, but setting it to a full 4 on the nose just doesn't seem to do the trick. Now, let's see what we can get. We could probably do 3.9 to 4, right? Oh, here we go again. Please wait. Hey, Windows didn't start. Ay, ay, ay. Now that Windows is done belly aching, let's see if we get a start screen. And if we get a start screen, do we get a blue screen? 3.9 gigahertz with a turbo of 4. The worst turbo in the world. We get Windows. For how long, I wonder? Oh man, this is so stupid. So 3.5 was one of those intermediate frequencies when there was nothing going on, then it would go down to 1400, etc. The voltage would go up and down, things along those lines. But if you watch this long enough and put enough of a load on the processor, you do see it go 3.9 to 4. Oh man, did I screw this thing up again? Okie dokie, it throttles down to 1400 as was the case before and the voltage drops to match. Let's run NovaBench and see if it crashes. CPU tests, and we're getting some, if it focuses, you might catch some 3.9s to 4s. 3.9 to 4, and then maybe we should try for 5 gigahertz on this thing, turbo. And I do have to sit up at attention for this one. Still doing CPU tests, and we're hanging around the 100 watt mark. Not really able to catch much of this on camera, but it looks like there is some jumping going on between 3.9 and 4. Oh, there you go. You can see a few of them going around. I'll bet if we slam the processor with Prime 95, you'd see all 3.9s. So, it's just the steps this thing takes. Alright, so let's see what happens when the graphics gets going. It's testing the RAM, which the RAM is garbage, so very, very outdated. It's not even DDR3 1600. Alright, let's see what we got here. 74, 74, 74. It's just, nope. We'd have to bring over the 1060 from Monolith for this thing to budge any further, methinks. Okie dokie dokie dokie. Yeah, very graphics dependent. We're not crossing 200 watts though. Of course, it is a 1050 Ti. Alright, what do we get? 667. Only 1 point away from being very, very unlucky. Next up, we should probably mess with the boost frequency. Blue screens, here we come. 19.5 standard ratio, 25 boost ratio, 5 gigahertz. Yeah, right, this isn't gonna work. No, it is not, as predicted.
Epic fail.
Let's try 22.5 for a boost speed of 4.5 gigahertz. Okay, let's see if it goes through. It's probably got a bellyache because Windows didn't start. Oh, look, automatic repair. Oh boy, yeah, check that SSD. And hopefully it doesn't blue screen in the process. Diagnosing your PC! Yeah, bozo, I set the boost clock to 5 gigahertz and the thing wouldn't start. Oh, your PC did not start correctly. Ya think?
Epic fail.
Once more into the 3.9 to 4.5 range. Swirly, swirly. Windows. Cool, I see a backlight, and I see Windows. Now let's see if we see a blue screen when we run NovaBench. Crash! Yeah, oops. Let's bring down the multiplier a little more.
Epic fail.
19.5 and 21, so 3.9 to 4.2 for the range here. And let's give it a... it's pretty much like that horrible turbo on the Skylake that only goes from 4 to 4.2. Right. Haven't had that thing fire up in a long time. I don't know, maybe I gotta change something on the motherboard. So yeah, alright, so we know we'll get into Windows, but can we get anywhere without a big blue screen? Well, we're gonna have all the diagnostic stuff again because it crashed. So, see ya when we see Windows, for however long it is. Okay, we got into Windows, ready to watch it blue screen? CPU test, baby! Targeted test CPU! Come on, let's see some 4.2s in there. Oh, there we go, 4.218. Well, if this works, we might be able to crank it up a little more. Sit up, or else we're gonna get... Oh, right. Almost 100.5 now on the processor when slamming the heck out of it. we can always get Prime 95 and see what it gets up to. It's only the turbo frequency anyways, which is a maximum of a few cores, I think, so looks like the 4.2s are going through without destroying everything processor-wise. I did used to do 3.6 to 4 on the old Phenom 2 instead of 3.2 to 3.6, so how are the temperatures doing? Yeah, 28 degrees or so. This doesn't have a stock cooler, so that's why folks like myself, we get curious about stuff like this. So, might be able to bump that multiplier up another half a point and bring it to like 4.3 or something. We know 4.5 doesn't work. So, whatever it takes to not blue screen the thing. I'm still not even touching any voltages yet, which is what you're supposed to do when the processor becomes unstable. So, I might actually dial in some settings from someone who actually did get something to work at a higher speed and see what that does. So, find a setting that someone did have work and then, okay, 1487, we're not doing well, 658. I think it's the power saving features of the processor that are holding everything back. So, I wonder. I downloaded the predecessor to Ryzen Master AMD Overdrive and got this thing to put 4.8 gigahertz on 6 of the 8 cores by overclocking the heck out of the turbo with 1.55 volts, which I think is too high. I think I'm hitting some kind of limit. Maybe the motherboard's voltage regulator can't really push things much further. But I've gotten this sucker up to 779 on the CPU score in NovaBench, which I think closes the gap with the Dellosaurus. 771, 773, 737. So I think I'm kind of, stuck in the 770s. I think I'm probably hitting a limit on the motherboard with the voltage regulator or some kind of thermal throttling. Because if we bring core temp over here, as I've been messing around with these settings at 4.8 gigahertz and as many cores as possible, I got this thing up to 47 Celsius versus a max of 80. Yeah, so I think I've hit some kind of limit here. So what I think I'll do is see if I can get this running at 4.5 gigahertz across the board, and then see if that gets me into the 770s without hitting the 1.5 volt mark. And if I can get that to work, then fine, we'll have closed the gap with the Dellosaurus, which is not overclockable. We'll have this, these FX chips prior to their Ryzen successors were overclocking beasts. And we know that this thing is not going to win on efficiency. So if there's a way to make it more powerful when it comes to gaming, then I definitely should go for that. Something else worth noting is that this processor has 2 levels of boost mode. So that's why I kept seeing 3.5 gigahertz and then 4 gigahertz on just a few cores. Right now I have it to where it'll just send everything up to 4.5 at 1.475 volts. I don't want to pass the 1.5 volt mark on this processor. So let's see how it fares with this. It looks like I was hitting a limit at the 770s. I might want to check the spread of the scores for NovaBench for the 8320E. To see if this is some kind of limit on what the processor can do before either the motherboard holds it back or the processor throttles itself. Well, that was fun. With the right overclocking settings, I capped this thing out at 4.7 gigahertz across 6 cores whenever the turbo kicked in. It was some really nice stuff. It was fun while it lasted, but because this was overclocked via a software utility, it wasn't all that great. I would restart the computer and it would freeze, shut itself off, or restart itself again and go back to stock clocks. I could theoretically start the machine at stock clocks and then start AMD Overdrive to add the increased performance, but who wants to go to all the trouble? And of course, neither this machine nor the Dellosaurus are ever going to touch Monolith. Not in a million years. The technology is just not there. They're just too old. Now the thing is, I went out and bought the Hippie chip in the FX series, the 8320E, basically to replace the Phenom 2 1092 and bring some semblance of power efficiency to Tuxedo. But both these systems, Tuxedo and the Dellosaurus, have their role as period pieces, so to speak. Each one of them represents something unique in terms of how long do these things remain relevant when it comes to PC gaming in this day and age. This machine will represent the dark days of AMD with its 760 until I get a better graphics card. And then of course the Dellosaurus's concentrated coolness is that it's a retail conversion, that I'm seeing just how far I can go at the Sandy Bridge and a graphics card that does not require external power. before I finally have to upgrade something. That's why I have these machines around. That's why I play video games on them. This AMD FX upgrade was to the hippie chip, the 8320E, not to the flagship processor 8350 or 8370. It was to introduce some efficiency to this system, even though it is an overclocking beast, and I can probably tinker in the BIOS and really make it scream. Why go to all the trouble? Monolith is always going to blast this thing into oblivion, and the Dellosaurus will do just as well at stock clocks and be a lot more efficient in the process. Nah, this was fun, but let's put the original graphics card back in here and go back to the Dellosaurus being what it is, and let this thing serve out its days as a representative, so to speak, of the dark days of AMD pre-Ryzen. Never, however, count out your friendly neighborhood Dellosaurus. There. See? 20s. When it's not doing anything. Not 60s. Now let's fire up Nova Bench and see why the Dellosaurus is the more refined computer from this era. 96, 96, 81, 51... Look at that wattage flying all over the place, as opposed to like 100 to 150. This is with the GTX 1050 Ti, where we just pulled out a Tuxedo. Way lower numbers. And for what, in terms of number crunching capability? Still going. 57. Oh, finally! It cracked 100 watts. Barely. Into test 3 now. Test 4. This is the discs and stuff like that, so it'll drop way down. Low 30s. Here comes the graphics. Higher FPS than the 60s and 70s coming from that other processor. 130 grand total. Not heading towards 200 watts, more like 150-ish. And higher frames per second. 132, 133, finishing up, and our score is 1820 with a CPU score of 830. There is no chance whatsoever that Tuxedo is going to catch up to that without a ton of overclocking. And we're talking a few years difference between these processors. So they all serve their purposes and they all have their niches. But the Dellosaurus remains the secondary system, while Tuxedo is a curious piece of history. A question that both of these computers will answer: how long will their respective platforms remain relevant in this day and age of increasing core counts and the AMD Ryzen? Till next time, this is MultimediaJay signing off. Thanks for stopping by.
Votre toast, je peux vous le rendre, Seigneur, Seigneur, car avec les soldats, oui, les toreros peuvent s'entendre, pour plaisir, ils ont les combats, le cirque est plein ce jour de fête, le cirque est plein d'automates. Le spectateur est dans la tête, le spectateur c'est un bel après-fracasse, apostrophe, puis c'est ta page, pour rester jusqu'à ce l'empereur, car c'est la fête du courage, c'est la fête des gens de guerre. Allons, en garde. Allons, allons.